Hello, welcome along to the home ground. We're talking property now with Max Schiffman and Graeme Samuel's with us, which are a great property man over the years, a great reformer in Australian government policy. Max, the Australian environment law and how that affects property. You've Graeme to your left. How do you see the issue and the reform?
So this is something industry and environmentalists alike have been waiting for some time. It's the reform of the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, the EPBC Act, and it's a very, very complex piece of legislation that governs how you deal with things like threatened species, flora, fauna, that sort of thing. And some of the complications have revolved around the fact that you have competing laws at both a federal and a state level. Amongst a whole bunch of other things. And so, Graeme led I think it's a review of that act back in 2020. And, at the moment, it's all sort of coming to fruition to finally see that change happen after all this time. But, Graeme, maybe you can talk us through a little bit about the sort of work that you did, where you saw those issues that have cropped up and, how the new legislation is now going to deal with some of those challenges.
When Susan Lee first asked me to undertake this review, which was in October 2019, I remember standing before the television cameras alongside her, and I had a pile of the Act and the regulations, about that high. And I said, here is 1,500 pages of Act and regulations, and it is almost substantially process-driven. It didn't relate so much to outcomes. Where it related to outcomes, there were a lot of weasel words being used, material, significant, substantial, and people didn't know what they meant. A lot of discretion. The other real problem was that there were two jurisdictions involved, the Commonwealth, which had a limited jurisdiction on environment matters, and states and territories, which had their own more significant jurisdiction to deal with environmental matters. And so, developers and others that were having to deal with environmental applications would have to make an application to the Commonwealth and an application to the state. And they might have separate assessments being made, separate approvals. It was so expensive as a process and took so long. So I had two fundamental objectives. One was to strip out the process and focus on the outcomes. But the second thing was to try and make it a much more efficient way of dealing with the environment. And there were two elements of that. The first was what I call single touch. That is, the Commonwealth would say to each state and territory, you can do all the work and you can do all the approvals, including those relating to Commonwealth issues, providing you agree to abide by the rules which would be set out in national environmental standards. They hadn't existed before. So that was the fundamental theme. And that brought about efficiency, but at the same time, effectiveness or efficacy by saying, here are the rules, you've got to comply with them. The second element of it was that the rules were intended to be very, very granular, very, very specific, so that you were left in no doubt as to what was required. They'd be backed up by guidelines and then ultimately by a compendium of rulings by regulators, a bit like the ATO tax rulings. And I call that the self-help mechanism. Now, the legislation, the Environment Reform Bill, it does just that. It deals with both efficiency and efficacy. So what it does is it provides for the ability to have single touch, accredited states and territories, but the conditions of their accreditation will be that they have to abide by the rules, the National Environmental Standards, which will be promulgated in 2027. Here's me thinking back of the 5 years it's taken us to get this far. It's not even 27, they'll be promulgated, I hope, in 2026. And then once we've got that, we've got a whole structure of very clear rules that will tell both developers and regulators and conservationists what it is that has to be complied with in order to comply with Australia's environment legislation. So we're there. This is one of the most important reforms that you could undertake in relation to protection of nature and the environment, for not just for this generation, but for future generations. As we progress through periods of time in Australia, it will work so much to protect threatened species. It'll recover threatened species that are almost extinct, and it will prevent, hopefully, more species going onto that threatened species list, which doesn't help anyone at all. I was recently at the Healesville Sanctuary down in Melbourne, and I was fascinated to see the work that's been done there by both the volunteers and the experts on recovering orange-bellied parrots, and also dealing with the threatened species in terms of the Tassie devil. And it's fascinating. It can be done, but it takes a bit of money, but it also takes determination. And the environment reform legislation that the government has produced with the good services of Minister Murray Watt, I think is going to actually achieve all just that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic reform, long overdue. As you said, it's been 5+ years since you finished that work. And from an industry perspective, the big challenge we faced was, it wasn't sort of maybe the line that, developers just want to moonscape everything and destroy everything. It was actually the inherent uncertainty in the process, because we would do work on sites and we would assess things in a particular way with the experts that we had to look at, land and everything that was on it. And then you would go into a system that was so convoluted and so opinion-based that approvals would take not just, months, but years and years and years, often going to black holes. You'd often have competing responses from the federal and the state bodies, and in the end it prevented so much development from happening, but it also didn't solve the environmental problem. So it's certainly a huge and welcome thing for industry to have a little bit more certainty about the process. And the important thing you said, which is what I think all legislation should be about, is actually being focused on the outcome, not on the process.
Yeah. And Max, the important thing was to get rid of what I call the weasel words. And the weasel words were words like substantial, significant, material, the sort of things that are very much judgmental.
Yep, all up for interpretation.
All up for interpretation. And the interpretation, when things are up for interpretation, ministers then have a conga line of advocates outside their door saying, the interpretation you ought to apply to this word material should be as follows. Then there's another conga line of advocates for conservation that are saying, no, the interpretation you ought to place on it is as follows. And then there's all sorts of trade-offs that states and territories are involved in, particularly with development fees and royalties and the like, particularly in the mining area. And the whole idea was to make it absolutely certain and clear with high degree of specificity what it was that developers, conservationists, regulators ought to expect out of the rules.
But that would have been a really tough balance to strike.
No.
It wasn't?
No, very easy balance, because you knew what was required, and what you were saying, what I was saying, I guess, in the review was this is, we know what we need to have in terms of an outcome. We'll get efficiency by single touch, and we'll get efficiency by setting out the rules very clearly, so that developers then know what they're going to deal with. Regulators know what they're dealing with. So it was quite easy to do, but it's. I have to say to you that Parliament, well, not parliamentary draftsmen, but departments do like to keep in weasel words. It gives that flexibility, and I think that it's unfair to everyone involved, to all the stakeholders involved. Conservationists don't know what to expect. Regulators don't know what to regulate. Developers don't know what to apply for. So you set it out very clearly. You have the argument before the rules are set. Once the rules are set, then you know what you're dealing with.
Do you think this could be a landmark piece of legislation in the sense of simplifying the language around legislation?
Yes, I've been involved in another review for the Deputy Prime Minister, Defence Trade Controls Act, and that involves the export of sensitive military material outside Australia. And again, I was very, very keen. I did this with Peter Tesh, former DepSec of Defence, and we were keen to actually have two things in it. The first was high degree of specificity as to what you could and you couldn't do. Then the second one, and it's arisen in relation to the Environment Reform Bill as well, is to have a very high level of penalties. Now, I'm a great believer in what in legal language is called inter rorem penalties. Inter rorem means terror. It terrorises you. And if you're looking at it, what you do is you say, those penalties are so high, is it worth the risk? Is it really worth the risk to do it? We did this with cartels when I was back at the ACCC, and we had legislation introduced to put directors of companies and executives of companies involved in cartel behaviour in jail. And it forced the executives to think, I can't buy my way out of this by paying a fine. I might go to jail. Do I really want to run the risk of going to jail? So the high level of penalties were really important. And for those that complain about those high level of penalties, my response is to say, you've got nothing to worry about. just don't take the risk of breaching the law.
Max has spoken a lot about reform in the Australian housing market, about pumping up supply in the right way. As an observer, putting your ACCC cap on, what reforms would you like to see to avert what is now a disaster, potentially disastrous situation?
Fundamental reform number one, it ought to be part of national competition policy, is get rid of the gatekeepers, which is the decision makers in terms of development, local councils, state governments and the like. It was there back when we did the review of supermarkets, and we said the problem is that local councils or state governments have got planning laws which are preventing the development of bricks and mortar supermarkets. And Craig Everson, who was the competition minister at the time, said, "I'm going to fix this." Good luck. You got no chance, and it won't. He didn't have a chance. Jim Chalmers, the treasurer, has now said he's going to try and fix it now, and I wish him luck. I just don't think it's going to be possible. But we've fundamentally got to streamline those so that you don't have potential developments, particularly of green acres into housing, held up by development approvals that are run by state governments. Environmental approvals will be dealt with by the environment reform legislation, but other approvals, and the not in my backyard syndrome, all those sort of things really have got to be dealt with. And the one way I think the Treasurer can deal with that is to say to states and territories, here's a deal. You clean those things up and you speed up the whole process of development approvals, and I will pay you a sum of money.
Well, that's actually what's kind of happening at the moment with the housing accord. So they've got an incentive scheme, which is if the states achieve more than the minimum hurdle set in the housing accord, they would get paid an amount.
Yeah.
My criticism of that has been that it's in arrears. So you've got to see what they achieve after 5 years and look back to see whether they deserve the money, rather than investing the money early on to do the regulatory fixes that I think they would need support for. And secondly, I don't think the incentive is high enough to actually make a difference. You're talking about, well, I'm testing myself now, but it was only several $1 billion spread across all the states, and you can imagine how little of a difference that makes to their budgets when they're all operating at the sort of tens and hundreds of billions that they are.
Well, I'll agree with half of what you said, which is the amount, and I think it's got to be worthwhile for a state or territory to deal with it. I'll fundamentally and vigorously disagree with this concept of paying them up front on the promise that they will do it. We did this with National Competition Policy Mark 1, which was the policy that was in place from 1995 to 2004. And what the government then did was it said, there's $16 billion in a pot. It's yours, providing you do the reforms, right? And then what happened was that the treasurers put them into their forward estimates, where we're going to get this amount of money each year over the next 10 years. And then someone, unfortunately it had to be me, had to say to states, you didn't do what you were supposed to do. Therefore, we're going to penalise you, take away that money. And that was very difficult. So my strong advice to the Treasurer now is to say, don't do anything more until, don't give them any money. Say that they will have a sum of money, providing that they agree to do something and they do it. And the moment they've done it, they get the cheque.
No, I completely agree with you there. I wasn't suggesting they would get the money absolutely up front. But what you don't get to see is the incremental improvements to the system be rewarded immediately. Like the cost of infrastructure, for example, to cater for the growth is also very high, and I don't think there's enough invested in that component to then support the housing and other things you need around it.
Well, I think we're in agreement then.
I think for the most part, I certainly wouldn't advocate giving them checks up front.
No.
They don't deserve it.
And to the layperson, you're speaking basically about incentivised reform, aren't you?
Yes, yeah. And you've got, look, unfortunately, because the forces against reform are vested interests. It was always a mantra of mine when I was doing competition policy, this is before ACCC, to say vested interest will be out there with loud megaphones. Consumers, the public, rarely march up and down the street arguing for reform. And so the public interest tends to take a back seat. And what you've got to do is to make the public interest take a front seat. And the only way to do it, unfortunately, is to say to state governments and to local councils and the like, we're going to pay you to put the public interest first.
And I noted a LinkedIn post you recently put up talking about some of the metrics and the bad metrics on the state we live in, Max.
Yeah.
Outline those, and maybe Graeme might have a view on that.
Yeah, well, look, I was referring to a couple of things that have come out in the press the last little while. There was the Business Council of Australia that came out with the ranking of doing business in the States, and Victoria was sort of dead last. We also know that from a budgetary perspective, the States in a real sort of challenging place at the moment. And whilst the government keeps talking about growing out of it as the solution, what's actually happening is that we're seeing per capita GSP contraction in Victoria. So we're not growing out of it fast enough. And Victoria had the second highest contraction in productivity and gross state product, only in front of WA recently. So none of this stuff is kind of washing. How do we, in a state like Victoria, which should be doing so well, sort of get out of this mire that we currently seem to be in?
Well, we've got to have people, I say this with great respect, other than you, putting these views forward. The problem is that the people of Victoria aren't listening. Until certainly 2 or 3 days ago, when Jess Wilson was elected as opposition leader, the greatest opposition spokespersons in this state were the Age newspaper, because every day they put something out that says, "Are you aware this is what's happening?" The Auditor General reports that are pointing out the inconsistencies or hidden deficiencies in terms of the financial accounting and the like that are occurring. So we've got to get the people of Victoria to be aware that these are the problems and that we're actually heading into a very serious financial position, upwards of $200 billion of debt, which will cost a lot of money each minute in terms of interest costs and the like. And that won't be paid for by government, because government doesn't pay for anything. It's paid for by taxpayers. Now, I noticed that when the Business Council put out its rankings of states in which people should do business, and Victoria is ranked last. And the Premier's response was a cute one, was to say, "I'm not interested in what that Sydney-based Business Council has to say about Victoria." But the important thing is that there's a lot of analysis that's gone on by the Business Council as to that sort of ranking. And those sort of things need to be brought out. Now, unfortunately, our state opposition hasn't been in a position to do it. I'm hoping that Jess Wilson, as the new leader of the opposition, will be able to do it if she can get some of the administrative people in the Liberal Party to put aside their differences and to focus on one outcome only, that is the next election. Then you might get some serious opposition in Victoria. And that's not to make a political statement as to who ought to be in government, but it's rather to say you need a serious, credible opposition to be able to keep a government honest. And that's, I think we've been failing in this state.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you wholeheartedly there. And interestingly, one of the other things the Premier says when you say business is not happy in Victoria is she'll say something along the lines of, well, I know many businesses are doing very well in Victoria. And so I recently put up a poll on LinkedIn, funnily enough, and I asked that question. I said, the Victorian government says business is doing very well here. Is your Victorian business doing well? And at the time we're recording this, it's sitting at about 87% of businesses saying no, they're not doing well in Victoria against the 13% that say they are.
Yeah. And look, you'll have that, but again, with respect to you, Max, you putting up that poll and you saying it doesn't carry the credibility of.
I think I'm very credible, Graeme.
Yeah, I know you think you're credible, but it's like business saying, business is self-serving. When we had the economic roundtable, I thought the only pity of all that was that it descended for a period of time into a tax debate. And every person, every stakeholder had their own vested interests as to what they wanted done with tax, whether it was the Business Council talking about lower company tax rates and the like. You get into a problem here where ultimately those in the broad electorate say they're all talking their own book. And you've got to have independent parties that are not doing that, or certainly good communicators that are out there to communicate. Now, Jeff Kennett did it brilliantly at the time of the Kane-Kerner era, and look what happened, and it was fantastic. Then, of course, unfortunately, he lost the plot in the second time round and lost the election. But you've got to have that genuine, credible source of information. The Age newspaper is providing it. Whether it's got the circulation compared to, say, the Murdoch newspapers, I don't know. But it needs some proper analysis by credible people that can say, this is what is happening, this is where you're heading, and this is not good.
Yeah, so a credible opposition and their voice is the only tipping point you can see.
Yeah,
for this
yeah, and with a bit of luck, no, I'll say more than that because I think it's more than luck. It's just possible. I know Jess Wilson from the time when she was back with the Business Council as a strategic analyst, and I think she's got all the makings of both a communicator, a leader, and someone who really is credible, knows what she's doing. All she's got to get now is the leaders of the Liberal Party in the administration to put aside their differences and to say, let's now focus on the election and focus on the success of that instead of worrying about John Pursuto loans and all this Supreme Court actions, which are just seem to me to be kamikaze type actions.
Yep. Well, Max, you might be her first housing minister. Who knows if you enter politics?
I don't know about that. I'm not quite ready to put my head up or have my hand up. Sorry to run for politics, but I completely agree with what you're saying. That we need to see we just need a credible opposition, and that keeps governments honest. No matter which way the cards fall next year, you need to have that sort of more robust public debate.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for your views, Graeme.